Hello. Hopefully my internet does not cut out on me again as it did yesterday. Alright, we're going to be starting on chapter 1. Go through all the various preliminary materials, and then we can get on to the actual text. Chapter 1, Preliminary Reflections on a Critical Literary Science. Epigraph. The world of traditional meaning discloses itself to the interpreter only to the extent that his own world becomes clarified at the same time. Jürgen Habermas. 1. Hermeneutics. Critical science differs from traditional science because it reflects the social significance of its activity. This difference creates certain problems that must be recognized if a critical literary science is to be fashioned. I'm not referring to that naive equation of individual motivation and social relevance that we encounter occasionally today on the left, but to a theoretical problem. The definition of what is socially relevant depends on the interpreter's political stand. This means that the question whether a topic is relevant or not cannot be decided by discussion in an antagonistic society, though discussion is possible. I believe it would already be a significant step forward in scholarly and scientific discussion if it became a matter of course for every scholar and scientist to advance reasons for the choice of his topic and the problem to be dealt with. Critical science understands itself as part of social praxis, however mediated it may be. It is not disinterested, but guided by interest. In a first approximation, that interest may be defined as an interest in reasonable conditions, in a world without exploitation and unnecessary repression. This interest cannot express itself directly in literary scholarship. Where it is attempted, in materialistic literary science is measured according to whether and in what form this venture is both a necessary and useful component of praxis aimed at change in a given concrete historical situation. We are involved with a direct instrumentalization of science that can be of little advantage either to science or to a praxis attempting to change society. The interest that informs and guides cognition can express itself only indirectly in the study of literature, namely, by defining the categories with whose help literary objectifications are understood. Critical science does not consist in inventing new categories to then set them against the false ones of traditional science. Rather, it examines the categories of traditional science to discover what questions they permit one to ask, and what other questions are already excluded at the theoretical level, precisely as a consequence of the choice of categories. In the study of literature, the following question is important. Are the categories such that they make possible the investigation of the nexus between literary objectifications and social conditions? It is necessary to insist on the significance of the categorial frame the researcher uses. The Russian formalist described literary work as the solution of certain artistic problems, for example, which are the result of the level of technique in the period of its origination. But when this is done, any question about the social function is already blocked at the theoretical level unless the presence of a social element in the seemingly purely art-immanent problematic can be shown. To be able to criticize adequately the literary theory of formalism, one needs a categorical frame that allows the relationship between interpreter and literary work to be thematized. Only a theory that fulfills this requirement is capable of making the social function of even one's own action the object of its scientific activity. Within traditional science, hermeneutics has made the relationship between work and interpreter the center of its efforts. To it we owe the insight that the work of art as the object of possible cognition is not merely given to us tel quel. To identify a text as a poem, we must fall back on a knowledge we already possess, and that is handed down by tradition. Scientific analysis of literature begins the moment one recognizes that the immediacy with which we perceive a poem as a poem is illusory. Schein. Mental objectifications do not have the status of facts, they are mediated by traditions. Hence, cognition of literature can be achieved only by dealing critically with tradition. Since we owe the insight that mental objectifications are mediated through tradition to hermeneutics, it is logical to begin our reflections with a critique of traditional hermeneutics. The two important basic hermeneutical concepts that Gadamer developed in his Truth and Method are prejudice and application. Gadamer uses the term prejudice in a broader sense than is common in colloquial language and without a pejorative meaning. With reference to the process of understanding unfamiliar texts, prejudice means that the interpreter is not merely a passive recipient who assimilates himself to a text, as it were, but someone who brings with him certain ideas that necessarily enter into the interpretation of the text. Application is every interpretation prompted by a specific contemporary interest. Gadamer emphasizes that understanding always involves something like the application of the text to be understood to the present situation of the interpreter. In the case of a judge's interpretation of a legal text or the interpretation of a biblical text in a minister's sermon, the element of application can be directly recognized in the act of interpretation. But the interpretation of a historical or literary text also does not occur without reference to the situation of the interpreter, and it is immaterial for the cognition of the process whether the interpreter is conscious of this or not. The interpreter, in other words, approaches the text to be understood with prejudices. He interprets it with respect to his own situation and applies it to that situation. To this extent, Gadamer is correct, but the content he gives the concepts has been justifiably criticized, especially by Jürgen Habermas. Quote, Gadamer turns his insight into understanding as a structure of prejudice into a rehabilitation of prejudice as such, end quote. This happens when Gadamer defines understanding as, quote, the placing of oneself within a process of tradition, end quote. Truth and Method, page 258. For the conservative Gadamer, understanding ultimately comes to mean submission to the authority of tradition. In contrast, Habermas has called attention to the power of reflection that makes transparent the structure of prejudice in understanding, and thereby can also break the power of prejudice. Habermas makes clear that to an autonomous hermeneutics, tradition appears as an absolute power only because the systems of labor and domination do not enter its field of vision. He thereby defines the point where a critical hermeneutics would have to start. Quote, in the human sciences, Gadamer writes, the interest in tradition is motivated in a special way by the interest and its interest, by the present and its interests. The theme and area of research are actually constituted by the motivation of the inquiry, end quote. Truth and Method, page 253. That historical hermeneutic sciences are related to the present is a significant insight, but the formulation, the present and its interests, implies that the present is something uniform whose interest can be defined, and this is absolutely false. Up to this moment in history, the interests of the rulers and those of the ruled have hardly ever been the same. Only because he posits the present as monolithic unity can Gadamer equate understanding and the placing of oneself within a process of tradition. Not the view that makes the historian a passive recipient, but Dilthey's, who insists that he who investigates history is the same that makes history, gains our assent. Whether they want to or not, historians or interpreters hold a position in the social disputes of their time. The perspective from which they view their subject is determined by the position they occupy among the social forces of the epoch. 2. Ideology critique. Hermeneutics, whose goal is not the mere legitimation of traditions, but the rational examination of their claim to validity, passes over into the critique of ideology. That the concept of ideology comprises a multiplicity of partially contradictory meanings is well known. It is indispensable to critical science nonetheless, because it permits one to think the contradictory relationship of intellectual objectifications and social reality. Rather than attempt a definition here, we will discuss the critique of religion that Marx develops in the introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, where this contradictory relationship is elucidated. The young Marx denounces as false consciousness an intellectual construct to which he yet does not deny truth. And therein lies the difficulty, but also the scientific fruitfulness of his concept of ideology. Religion, quote, religion is, in fact, the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet gained himself or has lost himself again. But man is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the world of man, the state, society. This state, this society, produce religion, which is an inverted world consciousness, because they are an inverted world. It is the fantastic realization of the human being because the human being has attained no true reality. Thus, the struggle against religion is indirectly the struggle against that world of which religion is the spiritual aroma. The wretchedness of religion is at once an expression of and a protest against real wretchedness. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world and the soul of a soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is a demand for their true happiness. The call to abandon illusions about their condition is the call to abandon a condition which requires illusions. Thus, the critique of religion is the critique in embryo of the veil of tears of which religion is the halo. End quote. It is in religion that this twofold character of ideology is brought out. 1. Religion is an illusion. Man projects into heaven what he would like to see realized on earth. To the extent that man believes in God who is no more than an objectification of human qualities, he succumbs to an illusion. 2. But religion also contains an element of truth. It is an expression of real wretchedness. For the realization of humanity in heaven is merely a creation of the mind and denounces the lack of real humanity in human society. And it is a protest against real wretchedness. For even in their alienated form, religious ideals are a standard of what ought to be. In the text, Marx does not differentiate explicitly between consumers of ideology, Volk, and critics of ideology. But only this distinction permits the special element of the dialectical mode of observation to be grasped. For the devout, the consumer of ideology, religion is an experience in which the self as a human being is realized, man's self-consciousness and self-awareness. For the atheistic emissary of enlightenment, religion is the result of a conscious deception with whose help an illegitimate domination is ensured. The accomplishment of these representatives of the doctrine of deception by the priests is that they have posed the question in terms of the function of religious views. Their answer, however, does not solve the problem, for it simply negates the experience of the consumers of ideology. It considers them mere victims of an externally imposed manipulation. The ideology critic also seeks to determine the social function of religion, but in contrast to the advocate of the doctrine of deception by the priests, he attempts to explain it by the social lot of the pious. He locates the cause for the persuasive force of religious views in real wretchedness. In this analysis, religion is unveiled as contradictory. Despite its untruth, there is no God, it is truthful as an expression of misery and as protest against this misery. Its social function is equally contradictory. By permitting the experience of an illusory happiness, it alleviates the existence in misery. But in accomplishing this, it simultaneously prevents the establishment of true happiness. The model is significant because it does not definitively establish at the theoretical level the relation between intellectual objectifications and social reality, but that it views this relation as a contradictory one. It thus allows individual analysis the necessary cognitive scope that will prevent it from becoming a mere demonstration of an already established schema. It should also be noted that in this model, ideologies are not simply understood as a copy, that is, a duplication of social reality, but as its product. They are the result of an activity that responds to a reality experienced as inadequate. The human being from whom true reality, that is, the possibility of a humane unfolding in reality, is withheld, is forced into a fantastic realization of himself in the religious sphere. Ideologies are not the mere reflex of certain social conditions, they are parts of the social whole. Quote, ideological factors do not merely mask economic interests, They are not merely banners and slogans. They are the parts, the components of which the real struggle is made." End quote. The concept of critique on which the Marxian model is based deserves to be emphasized as well. Criticism is not regarded as a judgment that harshly sets one's own views against the untruth of ideology, but rather as the production of cognitions. Criticism attempts to separate the truth of ideology from its untruth. The Greek word for criticism, krinein, means to part, to separate. Although the element of truth is present in ideology, criticism is needed to expose it. When the critique of religion destroys the illusion of God's real existence and the hereafter, it simultaneously permits one to perceive religion's element of truth, namely its character as protest. George Lukács and Theodor W. Adorno, among others, have applied the Marxist model of dialectical ideology critique to the analysis of single works and groups of works. Lukács, for example, interprets Eichendorff's novella Memoirs of a Good-for-Nothing as the expression of a revolt against the inhumane officiousness of modern life, against the efficiency, against the diligence of the old and the new Philistine. End quote. By using Eichendorff's terms here, Lukács wants to suggest that Eichendorff's protest remains at the level of appearance and does not grasp the essence of conjunction, which would be necessary for an understanding of these appearances. Quote, "Every gushing opposition is characterized by the fact that on occasion it perceptively exposes the contradictions of capitalist society, that it combats them with genuine embitterment and apt mockery, but also by the fact that it is incapable of comprehending the essence of this society. In most cases, this results in an exaggerating distortion of the problems and leads to a point where true criticism turns into a social untruth. Thus, the exposure of the contradictions of the capitalist division of labor is converted to an uncritical glorification of those social conditions that this division of labor has not yet known. Here lies the source of the enthusiasm for the Middle Ages." End quote. Insofar as Eichendorff criticizes the alienation phenomenon of bourgeois working life because it allows its aims to be prescribed from outside and adheres through the reward of leisure time to the image of a life of self-determination, Memoirs of a Good-for-Nothing has elements of truth. The romantic criticism of the principle of bourgeois means and rationality becomes untrue, however, when it turns into a blind glorification of pre-bourgeois conditions. For a long time, the polemics between Lukács and Adorno disguised what the two Hegelian Marxists have in common, which is above all the method of dialectical criticism. Despite a cutting remark about Lukács, who characterized Eichendorff as a feudal romantic, the following quote makes clear that Adorno also perceived in Eichendorff's work the contradictory structure that Lukács calls romantic anti-capitalism. Quote, "It is so obvious how much in Eichendorff stems from the perspective of the depossessed feudatory that it would be silly to criticize it from the social point of view. Not only the restoration of the sunken order, but resistance to the destructive tendency of the bourgeois itself was in his interests." End quote. What Lukács and Adorno adopt from the Marxist model is the dialectical analysis of the ideological object. It is seen as contradictory, and it is the task of criticism to spell out this contradictory nature. At least two essential differences from the procedure of the early Marx can be identified, however. For Marx, the critique of religion and the critique of society belong together. Criticism destroys the religious illusions, not the elements of truth in religion, in order to make man capable of action. Quote, "The critique of religion disillusions man so that he will think, act, and fashion his reality as a man who has lost his illusions and regained his reason." End quote. Marx, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, page 132. In applying this model to individual literary works and groups of works, this goal cannot be taken over tel quel because literature does not have the same status as religion, a point to which we will return. For Lukács and Adorno, the relationship between ideology critique and the critique of society is clearly different from what it is for the early Marx. The analysis that criticizes ideology presupposes a reconstruction of history. The contradictory character of Eichendorff's work only becomes comprehensible when it is confronted with the social reality to which it responds, i.e., with the transition from feudal to bourgeois society. The, the ideology critical analysis of a work is a critique of society as well, but only in a mediated manner. By exposing the social contents of works, it opposes other attempts of interpretive appropriation that either suppress the elements of protest in works or completely eradicate contents by reducing the aesthetic to an empty form. 3. Analysis of functions. The ideology-critical analysis of individual works differs from the Marxian model in yet another respect. By and large, it does not deal with the social function of the ideological object. Whereas Marx discusses both the contradictory nature of religion's social function and its contradictory character, being consolation, it prevents any action that would promote social change, Lukács's and Adorno's analysis largely excludes the problem of function. This exclusion requires an explanation, especially since the functional aspect is inherent in the Marxist model. Lukács's and Adorno's avoidance of any discussion of the social function of art becomes understandable when one realizes that it is the autonomy aesthetic which, in however modified a form, is the focal point of their analysis. The autonomy aesthetic, however, contains a definition of the function of art. It is conceived as a social realm that is set apart from the means and rationality of daily bourgeois existence. Precisely for this reason, it can criticize such an existence. Quote, "What is social about art is its intrinsic movement against society, not its manifest statement. Insofar as a social function can be ascribed to art, it is its functionlessness." End quote. Adorno obviously uses the term function here with different meanings, first as a neutral category of description, then with negative connotations in the sense of subjection to the reified aims of bourgeois life. Adorno also forgoes a functional analysis because he suspects that behind it lies the attempt to subject art to externally determined purposes. This becomes clear in his dispute with positivistic reception research. Adorno sees effects as something external to works of art. Quote, "The interest in the social decipherment of art must turn to art itself, instead of letting itself be fobbed off by the discovery and classification of effects that for social reasons often radically diverge from the works of art and their objective social content." End quote. Work and effect are juxtaposed here in an unmediated manner. Whereas one tells the truth about society, the other is rooted in the sphere of reification, against which authentic art protests. In a society in which all interhuman relations are radically reified, commerce with art is also subject to this principle. At best, reception research is therefore capable of grasping the universal reification, but nothing that is essential to the works of art. Thus, much will have become clear. Adorno's exclusion of the functional aspect has systematic reasons that can be found in his aesthetic theory and its socio-theoretical basis. Striking in the quote above is Adorno's juxtaposition of a speculative concept of the work of art for which he is indebted to the aesthetics of idealism, and a positivistic conception of effect. But in this juxtaposition, he foregoes the possibility of mediating work and effect with each other. According to Adorno, there are social reasons why bourgeois culture has failed to be egalitarian, as it should be. Only in the isolated form of monad-like works of art can truth still be spoken about this society. This is the function of art that Adorno can refer to as functionlessness, because it can no longer be hoped that art will provoke change. If it is true that in the ideology-critical analysis of single literary works as practiced by Lukács and Adorno, the functional aspect retreats into the background, one may ask whether the Marxist model of dialectical criticism can be applied to artistic objectifications and the problem of function not to be ignored. Herbert Marcuse's essay, The Affirmative Character of Culture, can be read as an attempt at such an application. Marcuse outlines the global determination of art's function in bourgeois society. which is a contradictory one. On the one hand, it shows forgotten truths, thus it protests against a reality in which these truths have no validity. On the other, such truths are detached from reality through the medium of aesthetic semblance. Art thus stabilizes the very social conditions against which it protests. It is not difficult to recognize that Marcuse is guided by the Marxist model of the critique of religion. Just as Marx shows that religion stabilizes undesirable social conditions, as consolation, it immobilizes the forces making for change. So Marcuse demonstrates that bourgeois culture exiles humane values to the realm of the imagination and thus precludes their potential realization. As Marx perceives a critical element in religion, protest against true wretchedness, so Marcuse views the humane demands of great bourgeois works of art as a protest against a society that has been unable to live up to them. Quote, the cultural ideal assimilated men's longing for a happier life, for humanity, goodness, joy, truth, and solidarity. Only in this ideal, they are all furnished with the affirmative accent of belonging to a higher, pure, non-prosaic world. End quote. Marcuse calls bourgeois culture affirmative because it banishes these values to a sphere that is distinct from daily life. Quote, its decisive characteristic is the assertion of a universally obligatory, eternally better, and more valuable world that must be unconditionally affirmed, a world essentially different from the factual world of the daily struggle for existence, yet unrealizable by every individual for himself from within, without any transformation of the state of fact. End quote. The term affirmative, therefore, characterizes the contradictory function of a culture that retains remembrance of what could be, but is simultaneously justification of the established form of existence. Quote, certainly it, the affirmative culture, exonerated external conditions from responsibility for the vocation of man, thus stabilizing their injustice, but it also held up to them as a task the image of a better order. End quote. Marcuse's definition of the function of culture in bourgeois society does not relate to individual artistic works, but to their status as objects that is set apart from the struggle of everyday existence. The model provides the important theoretical insight that works of art are not received as single entities, but within institutional frameworks and conditions that largely determine the function of the works. When one refers to the function of an individual work, one generally speaks figuratively, for the consequences that one may observe or infer are not primarily a function of its special qualities, but rather of the manner which regulates the commerce with works of this kind in a given society or in certain strata or classes of a society. I've chosen the term institution of art to characterize such framing conditions. In addition to the insight that the function of cultural objectifications is institutionally determined, Marcuse's essay tells us something about the functions of works of art in bourgeois society. A distinction between the level of the recipient and that of the social totality is in order here. Art allows at least an imagined satisfaction of individual needs that are repressed in daily praxis. Through the enjoyment of art, the atrophied bourgeois individual can experience the self as personality. But because art is detached from daily life, this experience remains without tangible effect, i.e., it cannot be integrated into that life. The lack of tangible effects is not the same as functionlessness, as an earlier ambiguous statement of mine suggests, but characterizes a specific function of art in bourgeois society, the neutralization of critique. This neutralization of impulses to change society is thus closely related to the role art plays in the development of bourgeois subjectivity. The attempt to derive from Marcuse's critical theory of culture the insight that social determinations of the function of art are institutionalized, and, secondly, to arrive at a global determination of the function of art in bourgeois society is open to two objections. Discourse about art, this procedure equates with the actual commerce with it. And whereas the ideology of art in bourgeois society may be comprehended, this does not hold for what this ideology conceals, the real function of art. In general terms, the question is this: To what extent does the institutionalized discourse about art determine the actual commerce with works? There are three possible answers. One can assume that the institution of art/literature and the actual commerce with art coincide tendentially, in which case a problem would not exist. Alternatively, one can assume that the institutionalized discourse about art reveals nothing about the actual commerce with works. In that case, the literary sociological approach suggested here would not promote the comprehension of the functional works of art. Behind this assumption lies the empiricistic illusion that an endless number of interpretations can make us understand the function of art, and that no theory is necessary. Whereas the first answer has the disadvantage of making the problem disappear instead of solving it, the second can establish no relation between the institutionalized discourse about art and the commerce with works. Hence, one will have to seek a third answer that does not predetermine the problem at a theoretical level. It might be that the relationship between the institution of art and the actual commerce with works must be examined as a historically changing one. Here, however, the difficulties inherent in the term actual commerce must be clearly understood. For the term generates the illusion that this commerce as such is accessible to the researcher. Anyone who has been seriously concerned with historical reception research knows that this is untrue. What we analyze are mostly discourses about the contact with literature, yet the distinction is not meaningless, especially where the comprehension of the function of art in bourgeois society is concerned. For if it is true that art is institutionalized as ideology in bourgeois society, then it does not suffice to make the contradictory structure of this ideology transparent. Instead, one must also ask what this ideology may conceal. Chapter 2: Theory of the Avant-Garde and Critical Literary Science. Epigraph. History is inherent in aesthetic theory. Its categories are radically historical. Adorno. 1. The historicity of aesthetic categories. Aesthetic theories may strenuously strive for metahistorical knowledge, but that they bear the clear stamp of the period of their origin can usually be seen afterward and with relative ease. But if aesthetic theories are historical, a critical theory of art that attempts to elucidate what it does must grasp that it is itself historical. Differently expressed, it must historicize aesthetic theory. It will first have to be made clear what historicizing a theory may mean. It cannot mean the application to present-day aesthetic theorizing of the historicist perspective, which understands all the phenomena of a period wholly as expressions of that period, and then creates an ideal contemporaneity among the individual periods, rank as equally close to God. The false objectivism of the historicist approach has been justly criticized. To propose bringing it back to life in a discussion of theories would be absurd. But neither can historicizing mean that one views all previous theories as nothing more than steps leading up to one's own. In such an undertaking, fragments of earlier theories are detached from their original context and fitted into a new one, but the change in function and meaning which that fragment undergoes is not adequately reflected. In spite of its progressiveness, the construction of history as the prehistory of the present, a construction that upward-moving classes characteristically engage in, is one-sided in the Hegelian sense, for it grasps only one aspect of the historical process, whose other aspect historicism lays hold of in a false objectivism. In the present context, historicizing a theory will have a different meaning, that is, the insight into the nexus between the unfolding of an object and the categories of a discipline or science. Understood in this fashion, the historicity of a theory is not grounded in its being the expression of a zeitgeist, the historicist view, nor in the circumstance that it incorporates earlier theories, history as prehistory of the present, but in the fact that the unfolding of object and the elaboration of categories are connected. Historicizing a theory means grasping this connection. It might be objected that such an enterprise cannot but lay claim to a position outside history, so that historicizing simultaneously and necessarily becomes a dehistoricizing, or, differently expressed, that the determination of the historicity of the language of a science presupposes a meta-level from which this determination can be made, and that this meta-level is necessarily meta-historical, which would then require the historicizing of this meta-level, etc. Not in the sense of a separation of various levels of the language of science did we introduce the concept of historicization here, but in that of reflection, which grasps in the medium of one language the historicity of its own speech. What is meant here can best be explained by some fundamental methodological insight that Marx formulated in the introduction to the Grundrisse. The example of labor, Marx writes, quote, shows strikingly how even the most abstract categories, despite their validity, precisely because of their abstractness, for all epochs are nevertheless, in the specific character of this abstraction, themselves likewise a product of historic relations, and possess their full validity only for and within these relations. The idea is difficult to grasp because Marx maintains on the one hand that certain simple categories are always valid, yet also states that their generality is due to specific historical conditions. The decisive distinction here is between validity for all epochs and the perception of this general validity, in Marx's terms, the specific character of this abstraction. It is Marx's contention that conditions must have unfolded historically for that perception to become possible. In the monetary system, he says, wealth is still interpreted to be money, which means that the connection between labor and wealth is not seen. Only in the theory of the physiocrats is labor discovered to be the source of wealth, though it is not labor in general, but only a particular form of it, namely agriculture. In classical English economics, in Adam Smith, it is no longer a particular kind of labor, but labor in general that is recognized as the source of wealth. For Marx, this development is not merely one in economic theory. Rather, he feels that the possibility of a progress in knowledge is a function of the development of the object toward which insight directs itself. When the physiocrats developed their theory in France during the second half of the 18th century, agriculture was still the economically dominant sector on which all others depended. Only in the economically much more advanced England, where the Industrial Revolution had already set in and where the dominance of agriculture over all other sectors of social production would therefore be eventually eliminated, was Smith's insight possible that it was not a specific form of labor, but labor as such that created wealth. Quote, the indifference toward a specific form of labor presupposes a highly developed totality of actual forms of labor, none of which is any longer the dominant one. End quote. Grundrisse, page 25. It is my thesis that the connection between the insight into the general validity of a category and the actual historical development of the field to which this category pertains, and which Marx demonstrated through the example of the category of labor, also applies to objectifications in the arts. Here also, the full unfolding of the constituent elements of a field is the condition for the possibility of an adequate cognition of that field. In bourgeois society, it is only with aestheticism that the full unfolding of the phenomenon of art became a fact, and it is to aestheticism that the historical avant-garde movements respond. The central category of artistic means or procedures can serve to illuminate this thesis. Through it, the artistic process of creation can be reconstructed as a process of rational choice between various techniques, the choice being made with reference to the effect that is to be attained. Such a reconstruction of artistic production not only presupposes a relatively high degree of rationality in artistic production, it also presupposes that means are freely available, i.e., no longer part of a system of stylistic norms where, albeit in mediated form, social norms express themselves. That Moliere's comedy uses artistic means just as Beckett does goes without saying, but that they were not recognized as such during Moliere's time can be demonstrated by a glance at Boileau's criticism. Aesthetic criticism here is still criticism of the stylistic means of the crudely comic that the ruling social class found unacceptable. In the feudal, absolutist society of 17th century France, art is still largely integrated into the lifestyle of the ruling class. Although the bourgeois aesthetics that developed in the 18th century freed itself of the stylistic norms that had linked the art of feudal absolutism and the ruling class of that society, art nonetheless continued to obey the imitato naturae principle. The stylistic means, therefore, do not yet have the generality of means whose single purpose is their effect on the recipient, but are subordinated to a historically changing stylistic principle. Artistic means is undoubtedly the most general category by which works of art can be described, but that the various techniques and procedures can be recognized as artistic means has been possible only since the historical avant-garde movements. For it is in the historical avant-garde movements that the totality of artistic means becomes available as means. Up to this period in the development of art, the use of artistic means has been limited by the period style, an already existing canon of permissible procedures, an infringement of which was acceptable only within certain bounds. But during the dominance of a style, the category artistic means as a general one cannot be seen for what it is because, realiter, it occurs only as a particular one. It is, on the other hand, a distinguishing feature of the historical avant-garde movements that they did not develop a style. There is no such thing as a Dadaist or a Surrealist style. What did happen is that these movements liquidated the possibility of a period style when they raised to a principle the availability of the artistic means of past periods. Not until there is a universal availability does the category of artistic means become a general one. If the Russian formalists view defamiliarization as the artistic technique, recognition that this category is a general one is made possible by the circumstance that in the historical avant-garde movements, shocking the recipient becomes the dominant principle of artistic intent. Because defamiliarization thereby does in fact become the dominant artistic technique, it can be discovered as a general category. This is not to say that the Russian formalists demonstrated defamiliarization principally in avant-gardist art. On the contrary, Shklovsky's preferred demonstration of objects are Don Quixote and Tristram Shandy. What is claimed is no more than a connection, though a necessary one, between the principle of shock in avant-gardist art and the recognition that defamiliarization is a category of general validity. This nexus can be posited as necessary because it is only the full unfolding of the thing, here the radicalization of defamiliarization in shock, that makes recognizable the general validity of the category. This is not to say that the act of cognition is transferred to reality itself, that the subject that produces the insight is negated. What is acknowledged is simply that the possibilities of cognition are limited by the real, historical unfolding of the object. It is my thesis that certain general categories of the work of art were first made recognizable in their generality by the avant-garde, that it is consequently from the standpoint of the avant-garde that the preceding phases in the development of art as a phenomenon in bourgeois society can be understood, and that it is an error to proceed inversely by approaching the avant-garde via the earlier phases of art. This thesis does not mean that it is only in avant-gardist art that all categories of the work of art reach their full elaboration. On the contrary, we will note that certain categories essential to the description of pre-avant-gardist art, such as organicity, subordination of the parts to the whole, are in fact negated in the avant-gardist work. One should not assume, therefore, that all categories and what they comprehend pass through an even development. Such an evolutionist view would eradicate what is contradictory in historical processes and replace it with the idea that development is linear progress. In contrast to such a view, it is essential to insist that the historical development of society as a whole, as well as that within subsystems, can only be grasped as the result of the frequently contrariant evolutions that categories undergo. The above thesis needs refining in one further respect. Only the avant-garde, it was said, made artistic means recognizable in their generality because it no longer chooses means according to a stylistic principle, but avails itself of them as means. It is not ex nihilo, of course, that avant-garde practice created the possibility of recognizing categories of the work of art in their general validity. Rather, that possibility has its historical presupposition in the development of art in bourgeois society. Since the middle of the 19th century, that is, subsequent to the consolidation of political rule by the bourgeoisie, this development has taken a particular turn. The form-content dialectic of artistic structures has increasingly shifted in favor of form. The content of the work of art, its statement, recedes ever more as compared with its formal aspect, which defines itself as the aesthetic in the narrower sense. From the point of view of production aesthetics, this dominance of form in art since about the middle of the 19th century can be understood as command over means. From the point of view of reception aesthetics, as a tendency toward the sensitizing of the recipient, it is important to see the unity of the process. Means become available as the category content withers. From this perspective, one of the central theses of Adorno's aesthetics, the key to any and every content of art lies in its technique, becomes clear. Only because during the last 100 years, the relation between the formal, technical elements of the work and its content, those elements which make statements, changed and form became, in fact, predominant, can this thesis be formulated at all. Once again, the connection between the historical unfolding of a subject and of the categories that grasp that subject area becomes apparent. Yet Adorno's formulation has a problematical aspect, and that is its claim to universal validity. If it is true that Adorno's theorem could be formulated only because art, since Baudelaire took the course it did, the claim that the theorem applies also to earlier periods of art becomes unquestionable. In the methodological reflection quoted earlier, Marx addresses this question. He states specifically that even the most abstract categories have full validity, only for and within those conditions whose products they are. Unless one wants to see a covert historicism in this formulation, there arises the problem of whether it is possible to have a knowledge of the past that does not fall victim to the historicist illusion of a presuppositionless understanding of the past, nor simply grasp that past in categories that are the product of a later period. 2. The avant-garde as the self-criticism of art in bourgeois society. In the introduction to the Grundrisse, Marx formulates another idea of considerable methodological scope. It also concerns the possibility of understanding past social formations or past social subsystems. The historicist position that assumes it can understand past social formations without reference to the present of the researcher is not even considered by Marx, who has no doubt about the nexus between the development of the thing and that of the categories, and thus the historicity of cognition. What he criticizes is not the historicist illusion of the possibility of historical knowledge without a historical reference point, but the progressive construction of history as the prehistory of the present. The so-called historical presentation of development is founded, as a rule, on the fact that the latest form regards the previous ones as steps leading up to itself, and, since it is only rarely and only under quite specific conditions able to criticize itself, leaving aside, of course, the historical periods which appear to themselves as times of decadence, it always conceives them one-sidedly. I'm going to read that again. Quote, The so-called historical presentation of development is founded, as a rule, on the fact that the latest form regards the previous ones as steps leading up to itself, and since it is only rarely and only under quite specific conditions able to criticize itself, leaving aside, of course, the historical periods which appear to themselves as times of decadence, it always conceives them one-sidedly. End quote. The concept one-sided is used here in a strictly theoretical sense. It means that a contradictory whole is not being understood dialectically in its contradictions, but that only one side of the contradiction is being fastened on. The past is certainly to be constructed as the prehistory of the present, but this construction grasps only one side of the contradictory process of historical development. To take hold of the process in its entirety, it is necessary to go beyond the present that first makes knowledge possible. Marx takes this step not by introducing the dimensions of the future, but by introducing the concept of the self-criticism of the present. The Christian religion was able to be of assistance in reaching an objective understanding of earlier mythologies only when its own self-criticism had been accomplished to a certain degree. Likewise, bourgeois economics arrived at an understanding of feudal, ancient, Oriental economics only after the self-criticism of bourgeois society had begun. I'm going to read that again. Quote, the Christian religion was able to be of assistance in reaching an objective understanding of earlier mythologies only when its own self-criticism had been accomplished to a certain degree. Likewise, bourgeois economics arrived at an understanding of feudal, ancient, Oriental economics only after the self-criticism of bourgeois society had begun. End quote. Marx speaks of objective understanding here, but he certainly does not fall victim to the objectivist self-deception of historicism, for he never doubts that historical knowledge relates to the present. His sole concern is to overcome dialectically the necessary one-sidedness of the construction of the past as prehistory of the present, and to do so by using the concept of the self-criticism of the present. If one wishes to use self-criticism as a historiographic category as one describes a certain stage of development of a social formation or of a social subsystem, its meaning will first have to be precisely defined. Marx makes a distinction between self-criticism and another type, such as the critique Christianity leveled against paganism, or also that of Protestantism against Catholicism. We will refer to this type as system-imminent criticism. Its characteristic is that it functions within a social institution. To stick to Marx's example, system-imminent criticism within the institution of religion is criticism of specific religious ideas in the name of other ideas. In contrast to this form, self-criticism presupposes distance from mutually hostile religious ideas. This distance, however, is merely the result of a fundamentally more radical criticism, and that is the criticism of religion as an institution. The difference between system-imminent criticism and self-criticism can be transferred to the sphere of art. Examples of system-imminent criticism would be the criticism the theoreticians of French classicism directed against Baroque drama, or Lessing's of the German imitations of classical French tragedy. Criticism here functions within an institution, the theater, varying concepts of tragedy that are grounded, if by multiple mediations, in social positions confront each other. There's another kind of criticism, and that is the self-criticism of art. It addresses itself to art as an institution and must be distinguished from the former type. The methodological significance of the category self-criticism is that for social subsystems also, it indicates the condition of the possibility of objective understanding of past stages of development. Applied to art, this means that only when art enters the stage of self-criticism does the objective understanding of past periods of the development of art become possible. Objective understanding here does not mean an understanding that is independent of the place in the present of the cognizing individual. It merely means insight into the overall process insofar as this process has come to a conclusion in the present of the cognizing individual, however provisional that conclusion may be. My second thesis is this. With the historical avant-garde movements, the social subsystem that is art enters the stage of self-criticism. Dadaism, the most radical movement within the European avant-garde, no longer criticizes schools that preceded it, but criticizes art as an institution and the course its development took in bourgeois society. The concept art as an institution, as used here, refers to the productive and distributive apparatus and also to the ideas about art that prevail at a given time and that determine the reception of works. The avant-garde turns against both the distribution apparatus on which the work of art depends and the status of art in bourgeois society as defined by the concept of autonomy. Only after art, in 19th century aestheticism, has altogether detached itself from the praxis of life can the aesthetic develop purely. But the other side of autonomy, art's lack of social impact, also becomes recognizable. The avant-gardist protest, whose aim it is to reintegrate art into the praxis of life, reveals the nexus between autonomy and the absence of any consequences. The self-criticism of the social subsystem, art, which now sets in, makes possible the objective understanding of past phases of development. Whereas during the period of realism, for example, the development of art was felt to lie in a growing closeness of representation to reality, the one-sidedness of this construction could now be recognized. Realism no longer appears as the principle of artistic creation, but becomes understandable as the sum of certain period procedures. The totality of the developmental process of art becomes clear only in the stage of self-criticism. Only after art has in fact wholly detached itself from everything that is the praxis of life can two things be seen to make up the principle of development of art in bourgeois society: the progressive detachment of art from real-life contexts and the correlative crystallization of a distinctive sphere of experience, i.e., the aesthetic. The Marx text that gives no direct answer to the question concerning the historical conditions of the possibility of self-criticism. From Marx's text, one can only abstract the general observations that self-criticism presupposes that the social formation or social subsystem to which that criticism directs itself have fully evolved its own unique characteristics. If this general theorem is transferred to the sphere of history, the result is as follows. For the self-criticism of bourgeois society, the proletariat must first have come into existence. The coming into being of the proletariat makes it possible to recognize liberalism as an ideology. The precondition for the self-criticism of the social subsystem religion is the loss of the legitimating function of religious world pictures. These lose their social function as feudalism ends, bourgeois society comes into being, and the world pictures that legitimate dominion and the religious world pictures belonging to this category are replaced by the basic ideology of the fair exchange. Quote, because the social power of the capitalist is institutionalized as an exchange relation in the form of the private labor contract and the siphoning off of privately available surplus value has replaced political dependency, the market assumes, together with its cybernetic function, an ideological function. The class relationship can assume the anonymous, unpolitical form of wage dependency. Since, end quote, since the central ideology of bourgeois society is one of the base, dominion legitimating quote, because the social power of the capitalist is institutionalized as an exchange relation in the form of the private labor contract, and the siphoning off of privately available surplus value has replaced political dependency, the market assumes, together with its cybernetic function, an ideological function. The class relationship can assume the anonymous, unpolitical form of wage dependency, end quote. Since the central ideology of bourgeois society is one of the base, dominion-legitimating world pictures lose their function. Since the central ideology of bourgeois society is one of the base, dominion-legitimating world pictures lose their function. Religion becomes a private affair and, at the same time, the critique of religion as an institution becomes possible. We now go on to ask what may be the historical conditions for the possibility of the self-criticism of the social subsystem that is art. As one attempts to answer this question, it is most important to guard against the hasty construction of relationships of the sort crisis of art, crisis of bourgeois society. If one takes seriously the idea of the relative autonomy of social subsystems vis-à-vis the development of society as a whole, one cannot assert that crises that affect society as a whole will necessarily also manifest themselves as crises within subsystems, or vice versa. To grasp the conditions for the possibility of the self-criticism of the subsystem art, it is necessary to construct the history of the subsystem. But this cannot be done by making the history of bourgeois society the basis from which the history of art is to be developed. If one proceeded in this fashion, one would do no more than relate the artistic objectifications to the stages of development of bourgeois society, presupposing these latter to be already known. Knowledge cannot be produced in this fashion, since what is being looked for, the history of art and its social effect, is assumed to be known already. The history of society as a whole would then appear to be the meaning of the subsystems, as it were. In contrast to this idea, the non-synchronism in the development of individual subsystems must be insisted on, which means that the history of bourgeois society can be written only as the synthesis of the non-synchronisms in the development of the various subsystems. The difficulties that beset such an undertaking are manifest. They are alluded to simply to make clear why the subsystem art is seen here as having a history of its own. If the history of the subsystem art is to be constructed, I feel it is necessary to distinguish between art as an institution, which functions according to the principle of autonomy, and the content of individual works. For it is only this distinction that permits one to understand the history of art in bourgeois society as a history in whose course the divergence between institution and content is eliminated. In bourgeois society, and already before the bourgeoisie also seized political power in the French Revolution, art occupies a special status that is most succinctly referred to as autonomy. Quote, autonomous art only establishes itself as bourgeois society develops. The economic and political systems become detached from the cultural one, and the traditionalist world pictures which have been undermined by the basis ideology of fair exchange release the arts from their ritual use, end quote. Autonomy here defines the functional mode of the social subsystem art, is relative independence in the face of demands that it be socially useful. But it must be remembered that the detachment of art from the praxis of life and the accompanying crystallization of a special sphere of experience, i.e., the aesthetic, is not a straight-line development. There are significant countertrends, and that it cannot be interpreted undialectically, as the coming into its own of art, for example. Rather, the autonomy status of art within bourgeois society is by no means undisputed, but is the precarious product of overall social development. That status can always be called into question by society, more precisely, society's rulers, when it seems useful to harness art once more. Not only the extreme example of